F1's 50-50 dream is officially over, folks. The combustion engine will rule once more. And it only took them 4 races to realise that. Wow. Yesterday, the FIA, F1, every team principal and every power unit manufacturer sat in an online meeting and agreed in principle to change the engine split for 2027. There are still formal steps to clear, including technical work, manufacturer approval, and the World Motorsport Council process, but the direction is now official. The contribution from the internal combustion engine will go up by a total of 50 kilowatts, whilst the MGUK's contribution to the overall power will be reduced by 50 kilowatts. Whatever kilowattage, the dream that was sold to the likes of Honda, Audi, General Motors, and Ford is now no longer a thing. But given recent statements from Ford and GM regarding V8s and the future of Formula One, I don't think they're going to be losing sleep over it. The official language is careful. They use phrases such as evolutionary changes and agreed in principle and further refinement of the 2026 framework. As you can probably tell, it's all very measured and all very collaborative, as in, hey, everything's absolutely fine. We all came to an agreement about this, and this is just something that is progression. I told you about this not long after China, that if they were to try and spin the 60-40 split, they would say that it was progression, that, oh, this is where Formula One was going to go. But there are differences between what the FIA said and F1.com said. That's basically the party line of Formula One management and Liberty Media. There's one word that the FIA used that FOM did not, and that was intuitive. The goal, according to the FIA, was to, and I'll just say this right here, is to make competition safer, fairer, and more intuitive for drivers and teams. Now, that's a hell of a word to use after 4 races, isn't it? The kind of people who would demand a racing car become more intuitive are basically the ones who are driving it, not the ones who miss the old V10 engines or anything like that. You don't change hardware because the TV coverage was a bit mean or angry or like bleh. More intuitive is an admission in writing that the car had started asking drivers to race against the concept as much as the opposition. We can all laugh about the quips that Max Verstappen has made over the last few months, but the one I think that really struck to my core was that of Oscar Piastri. Him saying that the last 15 years of his experience with motor racing basically had to be unlearned just to try and get a handle of the 2026 car. Maybe the 2027 car will be a little bit closer to said instinct. I don't think it will be completely the same as it was in 2025 and prior, but it certainly would be a step back toward that trend. We might even get more tweaks coming for 2028, and then we might see it all gradually phased out by the time we even get to 2030, and then the V8s potentially arrive. That is, if the majority of power unit manufacturers are willing to bring it in a year earlier, and if they don't, well, the FIA are going to do it anyway. But yes, the driver's instinct, us as the audience and the technical rulebook, we were not all watching the same race here. I can appreciate the technical achievement of even getting these Formula One cars out there, but for the majority of the audience, it's just not sitting right. It's going against their own instincts too. And I believe there are other ways to consider this that will make this land even harder. And we've heard a lot from the likes of the FIA single-seat director Nicholas Tombazis, and he's been talking again. Him recently saying we cannot be hostage to automotive companies. His technical director, Jean Monchot, followed with an acknowledgement that the electrical contribution had been too ambitious and that the combustion engine needed to be bigger. These are the guys who wrote the rules here, people. And we even got Stefano in the middle of his really bizarre interview last month saying that he too admits the engine makers got too greedy. But Tombazis went further. He explained how F1 got here, and this is for your consideration. Ahem. It's true the political landscape has changed, and back when we discussed the current regulations, the automotive companies who were very involved told us they were never going to make another internal combustion engine again. Obviously, this hasn't happened. Yeah, the manufacturers right here told the FIA to their face during their negotiations for these regulations that the combustion era in their boardrooms was dead and buried. By 2030, they will not be making a single one. For example, Jaguar ditched all combustion production in 2025, but based on the recent changes in direction there, it wouldn't surprise me if they change course a little bit. But yeah, that was the justification of the 50-50 split, the justification of using hybrid technology in an even more enhanced capacity than had been during the turbo-hybrid era. Green futures, the road relevance chestnut, the FIA really likes that one. Then the sustainability stuff. All of it rested on that premise and to get the likes of Audi and Honda on board. But the premise, as we witnessed, did not hold. The automotive industry, as we are beginning to see, is changing direction. Not ditching EVs entirely, but making just one part of their overall portfolio. But the problem with Formula One is that they locked all of that in back around 2021, 2022, when EVs were all the rage and petrol engines, oh, they were about as dead as the dodo. But as we have seen in recent times, including with the likes of Sebastian Vettel's Race Without Trace campaign, you can run classic V8s on sustainable fuels with a little bit of technical jiggery-pokery, and probably for a fraction of the cost. And as Ben Sulayem excellently pointed out, 4 of the current F1 manufacturers already make V8s in their road cars, so why not just make another V8 but for Formula One cars? But as a result of Formula One committing to the bit, they've had to watch for the last 4 races the cars being starved of energy in quite a few places, and the onboard computer, the software, dictating where cars should overtake and where they shouldn't overtake, going against, again, the instincts of the driver, something that wasn't made privy to us initially, but became apparent as races progressed. Now let's talk about who said what and when, because the timeline of events here over the course of 2026, ever since the shakedown, it's incredibly awkward. Cast your mind back to only the end of January. Domenicali was selling the 2026 direction as proof F1 had made the right call. Cadillac's arrival tied to the technical framework, with Audi and Honda in the same sentence. The sustainable fuel story, the 50-50 split, the electrification pitch, none of it presented as compromise, but as the intended formula working, well, as intended. But as we figured out from that interview from both Autosport and The Race, that all changed tack within a few months, within just a couple of races of the season getting underway. Domenicali, instead of saying everything was working as intended, was now having to push back about overtaking and then feeling artificial, asking the very, I don't know how to describe it, the almost pseudo-psychoanalytical question of, what is artificial? Overtaking is overtaking. And whenever someone has to do that, you just go, you screwed up. And he reached for the 1980s and the turbo era and all of that stuff. But then not long after that, you got Nigel Mansell, who lived in that era of Formula One, going, oh, well, he's talking a lot of bollocks to that, guys. But yes, the conclusion out of all of this is that the FIA has said that the cars need to be more intuitive. That's what it all boils down to. Do you think that's a fair assessment? The car should be more intuitive? Let me know in the comments. Because the problem with relying on the battery for a high downforce car is not something that is new, folks. We all hope that Formula One bods, the technical wizards within Formula One teams, might have been able to crack it, but unfortunately, they have come up short, albeit by just a little bit. A little bit of tweaking. They could make it work, but Formula One is in a rush to backpedal as fast as... Once the technology is cool, it is underbaked ultimately. You see, petrol is roughly 50 times more energy dense than what a battery can store right now. The battery does give you instant torque, yeah, but it can't sustain it forever. Not in a car that is as heavy as the Formula One car, or with wings that large. And I do believe part of the regulations for next year also tackle the idea of reducing downforce by, I think, making the rear wings smaller. So maybe reducing downforce might make the batteries even more efficient and maybe less starved still. But anyway, the most efficient use of that limited electrical energy is deploying it at the start of the straights, which then means you are starved by the end of them, and then you have to manage all of that through the corners. And I believe that goes back to a quote Alonso said, that you have to go slow through the corners to be fast down the straights, and that just doesn't seem right. And ultimately, the fastest lap comes from you not attacking the lap, and that is in a racing car. Yes, in Miami there were tweaks, and they did improve the overall spectacle in that they weren't the main headline, but they were still there, and clearly that was discussed around that particular meeting yesterday, and it did lead to the conclusion that, yeah, we do need changes to be had for next year ultimately. Politics were put aside, at least a little bit. And I don't think this is a case of nostalgia bait or anything like that winning the day. I think it's a lot more straightforward than that, because the drivers have been speaking up time and time and time again, to the point of annoying the commercial director of Formula One. They should be able to extract everything from the car, and the machine should reward the most complete performance. The lap should make sense to the person driving it and the person watching it, but instead, too much of this formula has been shaped by a conference room bet on where the automotive industry was headed, and led by a commercial CEO who, yes, did present and lead the Formula One team, but never drove a Formula One car, unlike Ben Sulayem, who did race cars. And credit where it's due, by the way, the race has been really hot on pushing back regarding these regulations from the likes of John Noble, Ed Straw, Mark Hughes, in this latest piece especially. They've all been really making it clear that they do not like these regulations one bit, and they are very much willing to put their reputations on the line to get the juiciest of interviews, because that second Domenicali interview, oh my goodness, that was wild, man. And all of the people that have been worried about these regulations for the last few years, they've now been proven right. They have been vindicated. But yes, I've got more for you, folks. I'm not just going to be talking about the 50 kilowatt difference from the combustion and the battery. There was another thing that was discussed and revealed today, and it's really going to please the likes of Honda, because quite frankly, it couldn't come soon enough. Honda right now are in a funk. Whilst the vibrations are seemingly sorted out, Aston Martin thinking so much into that, there was 0 upgrades for Miami for the actual car, the engine appears to be more than 10% of the benchmark engine, Mercedes. And the ADUO catch-up mechanism, that was built for exactly this situation. A manufacturer that far behind should get more spending and more development allowance and more test bench hours to catch up. And as a result, the FIA have officially ratified the kind of things that Honda will be getting, because, yes, by an estimated 60 brake horsepower, that is more than the 10% behind Mercedes. So as a result, they'll be getting a spending cap of around $11 million, with an additional $8 million for 2026 only. And oh yeah, they'll get more test bench hours, I think 40 more, so it goes to 230 test bench hours instead of 190. That's some serious numbers right there, and that should really benefit them, but they were also coming a little bit later than they were intended to, because you remember from last week that they were about to find out whether or not they were going to get an ADUO perk, but then the formal reveal was then suspended for reasons unknown. Well, I think we've now got an explanation as to why, because, well, we now got that. So there were probably some technical finaglings going on, so it must have been frustrating for Honda, surely, because around Miami, they probably wanted to know what was going to happen, given that they knew that Miami wasn't going to be a good one. The concern, according to the race, was that the mechanism couldn't become a slingshot to the front of the grid. Someone wanted to make sure Honda could be rescued without being launched past the people who'd done the better job. Mercedes, I think, don't need to be named for everyone to understand the shape of that concern. Wolff has already been clear that the ADUO would allow a struggling manufacturer to catch up, not jump from the back to the front in one go. In a way, that's kind of fair, but it is a political argument too, but hey, that's how these things work. Anyway, the vote passed eventually, and Honda will be getting additional help, even more than they were originally going to get. But the fact that this got suspended at all just tells you everything you need to know, that even though this was meant to look like charity, it was still a political case, that there was still some reasons to oppose it in some way, and maybe it was a little bit personal. Then, Toto Wolff revealed that he had also made some other demands within that particular meeting. His primary request from this meeting was not an increase in the combustion engine or in the battery side of things. No, it was to do with the straight modes. Okay. That's the aero configuration that opens up the wings on the straight. That used to be DRS. He said that we need much more straight line speed in straight modes. We need to be courageous in doing that. As for the combustion boost, he added, give us enough lead time so we can actually do it. Interesting. The team pushing hardest for straight mode extension is the team whose car currently performs best in it, and the engine boost benefits whoever has the stronger combustion engine, which may not be Mercedes. Yeah, I think it's quite clear that every manufacturer in that room had their best interests in mind and tried to get the best for their own particular team, because it seemed like the tides were indeed changing and that the audience was really getting irate, and that to do nothing would have been insane. There had to be some change for 2027. Although a couple of weeks ago, when this was all beginning to be burbling to the surface, we heard from many people, including Mr. Monsieur, that there was so much resistance that we all thought it was never going to happen, or maybe push back for another year to allow more lead-in time. But clearly, things have gotten so bad behind the scenes, they have to do something the next year. And this next part, I think, gets underestimated, and to be honest, I underestimated it too. The Netflix audience, the Drive to Survive fans. Now, before you turn off, this is very important. The fan who arrived through Season 1 of Drive to Survive and stayed is not a clueless fan anymore. They've watched enough of this sport to know when a public line starts wobbling. That fan has spent years watching team bosses spin disasters, drivers contradict official messaging, regulation changes becoming political weapons, and manufacturers protecting their own corners. Yeah, they may not know every single statistic or Grand Prix result in Formula One history. They may not remember who won the only non-McLaren Grand Prix in 1988, but quite frankly in this case, they don't need to, because it's quite plain to see the party line has shifted 3 times in 4 months. Anyone can see that. Back in January, Domenicali said everything was going according to plan, and then by May we get the FIA saying, oh yeah, well the cars, they really need to be more intuitive to the driver after all, so The audience are going to notice all of those contradictions over the last few months because they were trained to see it. So yes, Domenicali, F1 fans, especially DTS fans, are not stupid. If they've been watching plenty of these seasons, they're gonna know if they're being swindled, or if something is amiss. This is, to me, F1's first Netflix-era credibility problem. I'm not saying this because Netflix caused the issue or anything like that. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. DTS fans may ask this question: who benefits from the story being told this way? Now, there is a genuine escape hatch here, and it's been sitting in plain sight since the start, and that is sustainable fuel. The fuel is the thing that can survive the pivot with no issue, really. Should that chemistry hold and the carbon story works, F1 can maybe claim a lower carbon future while reducing electrical contribution and simplifying the power unit. As I mentioned earlier, Ben Sulayem is really pushing for V8s to make a return to the scene. Whether or not they will be naturally aspirated or turbocharged is something for a later debate. It might be just a case of figuring out who is willing to play ball and help shape the regulations to maybe their favour, and maybe those who are going to fight it publicly, or those who may be just saying, nah, not for me, okay, bye. But the results that are pretty obvious is that if you just have simple V8s with minimal electrification, as in a smaller MGUK, that is likely to be the electrical component remaining, you are going to have engines that are lighter and louder, and that will really please purists of Formula One. Cars may get below 700 kilograms once again. And for those thinking, well, what about the sustainability goal for 2030? Well, the sustainable fuel will carry that, because that's only going to get cheaper, it's only going to get easier to manufacture, and most importantly, especially for Formula One these days, it's a relatively decentralized means of getting fuel, instead of relying on countries that pump out oil all the time and then being susceptible to, war. So yeah, the battery, it will take a backseat once more. And I think, frankly, if Ben had his way, he would rather see a version of Formula One that looked more akin to 2006 rather than 2026, an entire generation of development being completely wiped out. But if they do choose to run with sustainable fuel, it might give F1 permission to say that, well, we weren't entirely wrong about getting a little bit more green, but maybe we just got a little bit too hot on just electrification alone. That might be the most important and useful thing the regulations of 2026 have produced thus far, or, well, ever. But the warning signs were there before the season began. Too much electrical contribution in a car with this much downforce, all with no MGUH to replace what the old Formula harvested? It meant that safety concerns about qualifying speed differentials popped up, with drivers publicly describing cars that didn't respond to instinct. And, of course, we then got a big crash as a result. Carlos Sainz, I think, put it plainly around the time of the meeting, him speaking as a GPDA director, him saying, it's just getting all the teams politically opposed to agree, which is what's holding everything back. He also acknowledged he has a Mercedes power unit too, so he's not exactly an impartial party. He said he could be very opposed to any sort of regulation change, given that he would be compromised in some shape or form due to the Mercedes power unit, but he chose to go with the regulation changes anyway. Did we hear any sort of rhetoric like that from George Russell? We did not. For Carlos, he said on the record that the gap between what's good for F1 and what's good for each manufacturer is an actual problem, and F1 sold 2026 as the future of racing to boot. Then the racing car got a vote, and look where we are right now. Racing, I think, doesn't really care how the pitch for Formula One landed. If the car's constraints are visible, it's ultimately over. So yeah, in theory, Formula One tried to sell something that looked good in terms of a concept and had the best of intentions, but when it actually came to the racetrack, it ultimately fell short, through the art of superclipping. And 2027 marks the beginning of the end, if it hasn't already, with all of the tweaks we've seen so far in 2026. And based on what Checo and Zach Brown has said, this will probably be the first of maybe multiple adjustments to the 2026 regulations. But ultimately, Honda's not got a problem with this because they will stand to get that little bit faster. As in, they'll be able to develop things, they've sorted out the vibration problems. Who knows? Maybe by the end of 2026, they might actually end up scoring a point. And that will be a huge relief for the likes of Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso. And what will also be a huge relief is that this is not the only F1 Ladderman video. There's this one here too, which I know you will like. I'll see you over there.